Amy, you can just do the welcome like we normally do, and I'll pick up from there.
Hey everyone, we are so excited to be at this Miami Book Festival. You guys are here tuning in to RockHill Publishing, and today we are talking with all of the sci-fi authors. So James, take it away.
Hi everybody, this is James Hill from RockHill Publishing, and today we will be having a discussion of science fiction with my two other science fiction authors, John Ford, who did Dominion, and Mark Everglade, who did Hemisphere. All three of us have written sci-fi novels, and all three of us have written in a very different category of sci-fi. So it should be a very lively and interesting discussion. Who wants to start off? Who wants to say what first? John?
Well, yeah, I would like to start out by, first introducing myself. My name is John Ford. I hail from a background in science. I'm an earth science major, meteorology. And after graduating from college, I just, through the peregrinations of life, I ended up in software, and I've enjoyed a fairly, gainful career in that field for, the better part of the last 20 years. And while I was doing that, I've always maintained a fantastic curiosity about the world around me, about multiple different scientific disciplines, and a healthy dose of imagination along the way. And over the years, I heard a lot of people tell me that I should try putting some of my thoughts down in writing, and I never really took it seriously. And then as I started to approach middle age, as I just dated myself, I started to think about it a little bit more abstractly, or maybe actually going the other direction more profoundly, about how much I would appreciate not being 80 years old and wishing I had done something. So, right around that time, as a stroke of luck, I was listening to a really, really fascinating show on NPR, National Public Radio. They had to do with, at the time, they were discussing these little organs in the human brain around the cluster and real densities along the synapses of the neurotapestry of the brain. And they're called microtubules, and they're like nanoscalar in size. And they're kind of conic in shape. And science had always kind of had a lot of postulation about what they might actually be there for. Biology doesn't really maintain anything that it doesn't use. I mean, pretty much, if you look around, that should be one of the universal laws of biology, is that anything that exists is there for a purpose. I mean,
I don't know about that, John, because I had all 4 wisdom teeth pulled out, and my dentist told me
I knew somebody was going to mention. I was waiting for the appendix as well.
And I still have my appendix. I'm not letting them go in and get anything. They can't reach it from outside. They ain't getting it.
Let's say that 99% of all the, but given the time, it's 100%. You know what I mean? Time is a variable in everything in the cosmos, right? We cannot separate time from the existence equation of anything. So
that is true.
But anyway, these microtubules are there, and they're definitely demonstratively there. So they're there for a reason. And so a physicist, unbeknownst to me, I had no idea this was happening, but a physicist in the 1990s began postulating that they may somehow be instrumental in the emergence of consciousness and so forth, and not really, that's where I picked it up from there, and I started having all these flashes of insights about what that might be. And I decided then, why not write a story within the framework of that idea, and that's where Dominion was born. And Dominion is a really, really hardcore science fiction novel at the beginning. And at the end of the novel, to paraphrase some of the things that you were suggesting early, is that it ends up more on the humanitarian side. So I kind of created a rainbow across the panorama of the different science fiction pillars, and I just started in one and just gradually kind of pulled the reader into, the gestation of the thematic arc.
As we call it, the arc of the story.
Right, you end up in this romantic, almost kind of tear weeping scene at the end, maybe, perhaps. I hope. You know what I mean? Because I love writing hardcore science and nerdy stuff, but I am a big softie at heart. You know what I mean? And
So John, let me ask you a question. For those people who are watching that have no clue what you mean when you say hardcore science fiction,
sure.
what is the difference between that and another kind of science fiction or a fantasy or something? I mean, how do we know when it's a hardcore science fiction?
Well, literally, if I would just use my example, and then maybe I'll like use an example of, say, cinema. You know, I always love to go to the movies because I'm a very visually oriented person, and it's a very good metaphor to just take something from the movie. So I'll probably borrow in the latter sense. But so Dominion starts out, we talk, when I say hard science, I literally, the scene opens up with the main character sitting in a lecture that has to deal with neuroscience physiology. And it is really, really, we're talking, I don't think there's a syllable in that opening sentence that's less than 6 or 7 syllables in the words in the beginning of this thing. And it's all on point. This is not invented material. This is what I mean by hardcore science, is that I actually studied solid state physics and I studied biology, and the imagination in synthesizing those two scientific disciplines together, that's where the fiction in the science fiction begins. But the other stuff is right on point. That stuff is true. You know, carbon nanotubes are true. Super fiber optics are actually true. The transmission of electromagnetism in those frameworks is actually true. The imagination is trying to use microtubules as an anatomical analog to carbon nanotubes and microtubules. You see what I mean? You can, having to wade your way through that is extremely hardcore science.
Let me tell you, you gave Athena fits with that book, and she was telling me, do you understand any of this? And is it, and I was like, yeah, I do understand it. Unfortunately, I'm nerdy too. And my background in science is also computer science. Like John, I went into computer science very young and didn't want to build computers, but had to understand the idea of memory and how language works and how binary works and things like that. So when you start talking hard science, you're talking about the actual theories and the actual physical parts of science, like the actual chemicals
that's exactly
physics and things like that.
So Mark, is your book as hard science fiction as John's, or could I understand your definition of yours? Because I could hardly understand John's definition.
Geez, I'm sorry.
No. We're proving a point here. So that was good. It was very good.
That's what's great about writers like John, is that they can not only imagine these big ideas, John could actually go into the laboratory and make it happen and experiment on it, while a lot of us just, guess and imagine. So on my side of things, it's more social science fiction. So
that's why I love it. I love that whole. I'm sorry, I don't mean it, but that whole sociological aspect of it. Because you and I have had great debates and discussions in our text sessions.
Absolutely. And so I'm Mark Everglade. I'm from Maryland, but I live in Tallahassee. My background is in sociology and anthropology, the study of human civilizations. I'm very interested in conflict theory, our relationship to the power structure and the institutions of society, how power, privilege, and status all comes into play. And while John takes his inspiration from the microscopic, and James takes a lot of his inspiration from space and the more solar punk, some of the ecological stuff, I take a lot of my inspiration from the grand landscapes, from the natural landscape, but also as an anthropologist, from the phenomenological landscapes, the collective tapestry of our cultural ideas and our social consensus. And so is it hard sci-fi? No, it's like social science fiction. But when I look at my favorite works like Orwell's 1984 and Brave New World, that's kind of what they were.
That's awesome. I love that. James, what about yours? Your science fiction?
Mine is like a bridge between Mark's and John's, because mine, it deals in space science but it also talks about the hardcore science and the theoretical science of space travel and being able to travel at the speed of light, at least at the speed of light. Because when you start talking about covering the universe and going to different planets, you're going to have to be able to somehow bridge that distance. And so there's that hardcore science aspect of it, but there's also the sociology aspect of it, of what will push society into these type of things. People didn't travel from one place to another just to see what was on the other side of the mountain. They traveled because there was a need. There was a famine, there was war in this section, so people fled to that section. And the same thing will happen that will drive people from this planet. And even in the 60s, which I'm a product of the 60s, talk about dating yourself, John. I grew up in the space age. I grew up, watching Gemini and watching and watching the Apollo mission and the idea of going to space. And we didn't go to space because there was some scientific discoveries we wanted to make. We went to space because we wanted to prove to the Russians we can beat them and we can build better rockets than they could build. And what was the best way to prove we can beat them? Put somebody on the moon and bring them back. That would be the high ground. So my book, Pegasus, A Journey to New Eden, talks about the science, but it also talks about the human aspect of it and how it pertains to the story, how it drives the story.
Yeah. Now, James.
Go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead.
Now, James, did you ever imagine that private corporations would start staking claims on resources in space, and there'd be an intersection of the private industry in space?
Oh, yes, because that is what drives humanity. Is from the beginning of time, it has always been commerce of some sort or another. There has always been the idea of what do we get out of this? How do we, in for a very simple term, how do we monetize this? And if we look today, people are talking about, if I go to Mars, I no longer have to obey the rules of Earth. I'm going to monetize that. If I go to the moon, I'm no longer going to obey the laws of Earth don't apply. Why don't they apply? You're still people. The people are still the same, but and the same thing happened when people came to America. They left Europe and they immediately said, hey, we're no longer part of you. We don't obey your laws. We set up our own laws and our own companies and our own way of life. And it's just human nature to do that. And that is the driving force of nature, or at least of people.
My mother, was an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and so I've always had sort of a passive interest in these kinds of areas, and I watch a lot of these kinds of informatics shows and so forth about this kind of stuff. I've also done some reading, and one of the things that really separates a part of human ingenuity from other critters is that will to discover is actually keyed into resource procurement, really, because when we move into a region, we tend, with our ingenuity, to overexhaust those resources. And there's evidence of this going back thousands of years. And then what happens is the younger, healthier generations have to have a process of interested into discovery and curiosity that feeds back into going over that hillside to go find, and look what I got. We've got maize over here. Now we don't need to use this. We don't have to eat bark. We can eat corn, that kind of a thing. So that's sort of hot wired into our evolutionary background. So I think it was really fascinating that you referenced that, because that's spot on, actually, from everything that I've been exposed to in that area. Maybe Mark might have something.
Yeah, I mean, the mind is definitely a novelty-seeking device. It's always looking to push the frontier. That's how it learns. If it didn't seek novelty, you would never learn anything.
Right, exactly. So going and discovering stuff just sort of happens to parlay and discovering new resources that can help the community survive and so forth. So, and
let me ask you this question, because we're all science fiction writers here, and we each touched on this a little bit. Do you write your story from a character base, or do you write your stories from a plot base? And the difference between character-based story, like you said, John, your story started off very heavily into the science, but it ended up being more emotionally about the characters.
Right.
So you kind of like arced over from plot to character.
And I have to tell
I started the other way. I started with plot, with character, and arced over more into the plot of the story. And I think, Mark, you started and stayed pretty much with character.
Yes.
Well,
So,
to answer your question, James, I would have to say very definitively that I went with the plot structure method because I had an idea of how it was going to affect the characters towards the end of the book, but I needed the audience to understand why these characters were acting the way they were. So that would require blocking out these information episodes, and that's what those first several chapters are. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, this Dominion device is sort of acting psionic because it, taps into the quantum mechanic oscillation realm, and maybe there's a spirit there. And I'm just asking the implicit question. I'm trying to venture the reader through that possibility as opposed to saying, just telling him in a blanket. I could tell you what the story is in 10 sentences. But who wants that?
Yeah, well, that is plot. If you can. You have to be able to boil it down to 10 seconds if you want to send it to a publisher.
Right. Well, I tried with you.
I don't want to read the whole book just to figure out what the plot is, but as a reader, you do.
John, you said you got your idea from listening to that NPR radio program, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you heard that, you had this idea, and you're like, why not write about it? So, yeah. Mark, do you know exact? I mean, I think that's great that you know exactly where your book, the origin of your book. Mark, what about you for your book? Do you know how the idea for Hemispheres went down?
Yes. So, that's a good question, Sandy. And really, I conceive of the characters almost as entire groups of people in society. So in Hemispheres, there's different factions of society that emerged, like religious zealots, those employed by a dystopian government, feminist radicals fighting for equality, and AI, two sentient alien species. So the story is really based on how these groups react to the threats of change in the landmass as a group increases a tidal lock planet's rotation to bring daylight to a dark hemisphere. So I was asking myself, how do these different groups of people react to this? So the religious zealots see any interference with the natural order as being perverse. The government is mostly concerned about destroying the light-based economy and maintaining the economy. The AI sees this whole thing as an opportunity to secure resources. The aliens are trying to essentially see it as an opportunity to create chaos. So to me, the factions, these different groups in society, are as much a character in and of themselves with their different conflicts and dynamics and inner politics as the individual characters are.
And I love that. So I can see from your talking about your book and where it started, I can see your socialism coming through, all of that, your different groups of people. From John, I can see, we can see John and your background, how that came through when you heard that NPR program. And I mean, it's just amazing to me that you guys are getting a whole book out of one little piece. But James, what about you? You got not only a whole book, a whole career, a whole lifetime. So where did your science fiction book, the idea come from?
Surprisingly enough, it came from my wife at the time, back in I'm going to date myself, back in the 80s, when they were talking about the SALT treaties. And the SALT treaties are the Strategic Arm Reduction or Limitation Treaty. And she asked me, what did I think about the SALT treaty, the negotiation that we were doing with Russia about limited arms. And I told her, we wouldn't have to really worry about nuclear war because we had no place else to go. So the idea was, once we're able to find some place where we can live, and we have to be able to bring with us the comforts of home, okay? No one really got on the ship and went anywhere and left everything behind. They usually try to bring what they had with them to the new lands. So until we find that type of situation, we didn't really have to worry about nuclear war. And so my story jumped ahead several generations, and we found some place we can go. And of course, I picked the nearest planet, nearest star system. Yeah, Alpha Centauri. And surprisingly enough, Alpha Centauri is a binary star system. I think maybe a tri-star system.
And they found that it has a planet that's roughly Earth in dimension.
Right. Yes, and we are now finding planets all over the universe because there's a calculation that tells you how many livable planets there should be.
Drake equation. It's called the Drake equation.
The Drake equation. Yes, it is.
Right.
And we are not alone in this universe. I truly believe that there are other civilizations, there's other habitable planets, and therefore, when we find one, and we can go there, and my book starts off with first moving into space, into these satellites and into space stations around Earth, moving off into the moon, moving further out, taking those steps that wouldn't naturally occur as you go exploring, as you go moving out. And these things are now happening now. Now we're talking about going to Mars. And it is a real possibility that within my lifetime, will be living on Mars. And within my grandson's lifetime, definitely will be living on Mars. And at that point, the Earth may not survive the next, bad guy to come along with ideas of, I'm taking everything over. Because now they got someplace else to go. And therefore, we can nuke the world. It's a little dark, and that's unfortunately is my life. But I grew up in the nuclear era. I grew up in the idea of great things can happen, but also bad things have happened. I grew up in the 60s. So we have both the love child and civil strife, and it doesn't go away. The cycles never go away.
Speaking to that, I think of the 1980s as what I would call a smoldering dystopia. It wasn't actually, or maybe a soft dystopia would be a better word. It just wasn't a hard dystopia, because I remember the idea of the fear of nuclear holocaust lording over me as a 9-year-old. And that was actually a lot of stress for a kid. I mean, I was a precocious little brat, I mean, I didn't necessarily have the necessary articulation skills to tell you what I was thinking, but I understood that we could all get vaporized at any moment. And that's
well, imagine growing up in the 60s
as a child.
Imagine growing up in the 60s and seeing decade after decade of war. Because when I grew up, I had a real chance of winding up in Vietnam. Vietnam ended when I was 17, luckily for me.
Yeah, and I'm older than you, so I can remember the what was it, duck and
Korean
cover
War?
or something like that. I remember when people were building, things in their backyard to protect them from the
bomb shelters and stuff.
Yeah,
oh,
bomb
yes.
shelters. So yeah, so each generation has kind of had its own, stark reality of what could happen. And what I absolutely love, and this is what I want to point out, is we're going to have to close this because we're coming up on time.
It's already over. I was just getting going. I have some.
I know.
We only got a half hour.
I have all these ideas. I wanted to get into the whole thing about the Fermi paradox. All right.
You know what I love about, and this is the conclusion, what I love about it is each generation faced its own set of potential catastrophes, disasters, all of that. And yet what you guys have done is write about them in a fictitious way so you can show what a possibility that could have come out of that. Or
thank you so much for saying that, Sandy, because one of the little sidecar stories to that, right in that interval when I was thinking about writing, I had just watched this fascinating PBS show that really discussed all the frontiers of science fiction, because it's actually recent in literary history. Science fiction is really only about 150 years old, and from H.G. Wells all the way up to Michael Crichton and Asimov and to, the most recent recent authors, they all shared one common thing in common that separates them from just anybody who writes. The big ones. They took the school of what was happening now and extrapolated a vision of what it might mean consequentially to the future. And that is exactly what you just said. And that was what I tried to do. I tried to look at AI as an implication more so than just check this out. You know what I mean?
And
I
they're
think
all
that
possible.
the proof does that.
That's a very real possibility. So you just, like you said, extrapolated on that. And so, and James, with talking about what he faced, and Mark, so I think it's great. We're gonna have to close now, but I love that we're having these discussions. So James, what's on for tomorrow night?
Okay, so tomorrow night we will be talking, I think live readings.
It is going to be so today was the panel discuss live interviews.
Live
so tomorrow
interviews,
night,
yeah.
Tuesday, live interviews. So who are we interviewing tomorrow night?
Well, we'll have John back so he can further expound on his ideas. And we're going to have Haley, H.C. Kilgore, and we are going to have me. I'm going to be back again.
So Amy and I will be here with you. Amy Ravichandran is our technological, person. And and I'm just the person that's here to ask all the questions and make sure we're moving in the right direction and not getting stuck in a circle here. So it's been great. You guys were all great. Thanks for letting me intervene and ask questions when you understand that I know very little about science fiction, even though I am married to someone who loves it and who reads it. And I started to tell you his favorite author, but the name slips me, so we don't have time. I'll tell you that tomorrow night. But it's been great talking to you, and we'll see you tomorrow night, 7:00 Eastern, at the Miami Book Fair online. We're in the marketplace. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks, Sandy, Amy, and my fellow authors and publishers. It's always a pleasure to share company with you.